All right, let's take a look at the final phrase of the Bach C major prelude. So I'm starting here at measure 32. And again, let's just read the notes. When we're done with this particular analysis of measures 32 through 35, let's put it together with the previous phrase that begins at measure, what is that, 22 or 21? Well, we'll figure it out. Or 20? I don't want to guess. We'll take a look. All right. Without further ado, measure 32. So reading the notes. So we've got C in the bass. I'm going to highlight as we progress. Up an octave to C. So that is C2 up to C3, up to the treble G3, B flat 3, and E4. And then the rest of the notes, of course, repeat. So if you put those notes together, those are C, E, G, and B flat, and that is a C dominant 7th chord. Now, that is actually a really interesting surprise given where we were. If you recall, the previous phrase had multiple iterations, 8 measures of G dominant pedal. And after all of that buildup of the dominant, we were expecting, of course, a resolution to the tonic, which does happen because the first thing that you hear as we go to the downbeat of measure 32 is this low C in the bass. That's C2. So you definitely get that dominant to tonic authentic progression. That's G down to C. But what ruins it, well, quote unquote, or what ruins the absolute resolution from dominant to tonic is the insertion of this B flat and the creation of a dominant instead of the expected tonic. Now, this is not a dominant in the key of C. This is a dominant in the key of F. So this is an example of another secondary dominant belonging to the subdominant chord F. Remember the subdominant in reference to our home key, our primary key of C. So the way that you would label this is a 5/7, because it's in root position after all, of F. So it's a 5/7 of 4. Okay, F being the 4 chord in the key of C. The most important thing that you need to take away from this is that this is yet another delay in ultimate resolution. And that's what this entire prelude is really about. If we had to kind of find, let's say, 1 or 2 motivic items that summarize what Bach's compositional plan was in this prelude, one of them, I would argue, is the constant delaying of cadences, right? Of actually satisfying resolved authentic cadences. And this is yet another example. So in measure 31, we go from a G7 to 32, a C7, and then if you look at 33, so the beginning of the next system, this is, well, let's take a look. All right, so reading from the bass on up. So again, we have C, again, a repetition of the C from the previous measure. So this is beginning to look like a pedal, right? In this case, a tonic pedal as opposed to the dominant pedal of the previous phrase. So we have again C2 up to C3, and then you got to read those ledger lines, F3, A3, 2 ledger lines down, and then finally C4 and all the way up to F4. Now this measure is very different from the other measures because, as you can see, it's one big arpeggiation down through 2 individual harmonies. This is new because the harmonic rhythm of this entire prelude, remember that harmonic rhythm just means how often the harmonies change. In all the remaining measures, there is 1 harmony per bar. In measure 33, there are 2 harmonies. In fact, it splits basically down the middle. So the first half note of the measure is an F major chord over its 5th, right? So over the tonic pedal. So that's F over C. And then let's just examine what the notes are in the second half. So I'm going to start at C4 that begins the onset of beat 3, and let's just trace the arpeggiation down. So it's C going down into the bass clef, A3, F3, back to A, down to F, and then a new note. That's obviously D3. So the notes here are read from lowest to highest, D, F, A, C. So let's play that. So I'm going to play this in the fourth octave. So D, F, A, and C5. Again, I'm not playing the music as it's actually written in the score. I'm just isolating the D minor 7 chord. So that means that here we have a D minor 7 chord over C. All right, so let's put some labels down. As far as the F over C chord goes, I'm kind of two minds as to how to analyze this. We could say that this is a 4 chord in second inversion, but the problem with that particular label is it kind of betrays what's actually happening here. Take a look at measures 32 to the end, measure 35. Do you observe that the entire time all we have in the bass is that reiteration of the tonic, right? C2. In fact, how many times? In measure 32 twice, in measure 33 twice, 34 twice, and finally in measure 35. So that is 7 iterations as half notes and then a whole note of the tonic pedal. So on the downbeat of measure 33, to indicate that this is simply a 4 chord in 6/4 inversion, while technically correct, is not exactly what's happening here. What I would argue is that you might attempt to also write this, so I'll put this as a second option. You might write a 4 chord over TP, which in this case stands for tonic pedal. All right? Remember that this labeling, the nomenclature here, it both describes the music, but it's also kind of secondary to the music. And what I mean by that is, without getting overly philosophical, is that this is just a way of understanding what otherwise won't change whether or not we label it or don't. In other words, this measure, measure 33, sounds like this. And then we'll get to that D minor 7 chord in a moment. Whether or not I label it or no, it's F major with C in the bass. So is that a 4/6/4 or is it a 4 over tonic pedal? It doesn't really matter. What you need to understand is that somehow we have harmonies above the tonic pedal that are sometimes negating the feeling of complete resolution that we really only properly get when we hear a tonic chord, as we do in measure 35. So this is just more of Bach's delay tactics. That's exactly what he's doing here. So let's take a look now at the second half of measure 33. Clearly we have that D minor 7 chord because of the addition of the D, specifically here I'll circle it, the D3 right there in the antepenultimate and ultimate 16ths of the measure. So as far as labels go, you could write that this is a 2 minor 7 like that, again, over tonic pedal. But you can also write that this is a 2 chord in third inversion, right? That is over its 7th. So that's a 2/4/2. Now, you might catch me on this and say, but wait a second. In the 4 chord, you didn't like 4/6/4 with the figures. So why would you prefer 2/4/2 here? Okay. You have to follow my logic here. The 2/4/2, to me, as an analyst, makes sense not by itself. The 2/4/2 makes sense in reference to the very first progression of this entire prelude. So if you recall, the prelude begins as follows. So those opening 4 measures, what are the chords? Well, the first chord is a C major. The second measure is a D minor 7 over C. Here it is. Here's that C in the bass. Measure 3 is a G7 over B. And measure 4 is just a C chord. So the 2/4/2 that happens in measure 2, again, D minor 7 over C, 2/7 in third inversion, 2/4/2, it reoccurs here at the end as part of a progression in the very final phrase that is not just reminiscent of the opening, but is practically identical with one exception. This time we have a consistent tonic pedal starting in measure 32 to the end. So for me, the kind of repetition, the recapitulatory opening phrase reappearing here at the end starts from the second half of measure 33. In which case the question becomes, what is the purpose of the first half of measure 33? Well, recall that this F major chord that arrives on the downbeat of measure 33 is temporarily tonicized by the preceding C dominant seventh chord in measure 32. What that means is, just within the local view of these measures, we have a dominant in measure 32, albeit secondary, and then a tonic, albeit secondary, on the downbeat of 33. So functionally, for a moment, the F major chord is acting as a secondary tonic supported in the bass by the piece's primary tonic. So think about what this actually ends up meaning. It means that measure 33 is a compression of the first two measures of the piece. Remember, the first two measures, going back to the very opening of the prelude, are C major and then D minor 7 over C. But if we were to compress them into the space of one measure, we end up getting the equivalent here at the end of the piece, which is F major over C, and then D minor 7 over C. And all this takes place twice as fast, right? So it's a kind of diminution of the opening two measures into one. But functionally, it's very similar to the opening. So it is a kind of modified recapitulation of the opening phrase. It's really fascinating. But as far as that mentality is concerned, the way that I'm choosing to analyze these measures, for me personally, the more logical label for the F over C becomes 4 over tonic pedal, because I am demonstrating that there is a tonic function at play in terms of the bass, and the secondary tonic for the 4 chord being that it's preceded by its own dominant, right? That's secondary C7. And then for the rest, I'm choosing 2-4-2 because that's the same chord that we get in measure 2 of the piece. So it's a full recapitulation. And then going forward to measure 34, let's take a look at these notes. So again, we have our tonic pedal, C, followed by, of course, B2, and then we leap all the way up to G4, and then B, D, and F. And if you trace the rest of this arpeggiation or broken chord, there is no change of harmony. This is simply a G7 chord where the lowest chord tone is B, that is the B2 all the way down, articulated initially on the 2nd 16th of the measure. So this is a G7 over B, meaning this is a first inversion dominant 7th chord over the tonic pedal, which is C. So as far as the label goes, this becomes a 5, 6, 5, just like that, over tonic pedal. Okay, and then in measure 35, it just simply resolves to a C major chord, and it's the first time that we get a chord that is sounded, articulated, all as one block, right? A block chord as opposed to a broken chord. If you go into the history of this piece, it was most likely composed for a clavichord, which is kind of a relative to the harpsichord. And there are certain restrictions on the ability of a clavichord to play certain notes simultaneously or harmonically. So for this piece to be a series of arpeggiations makes a lot of sense for the capabilities and technological limitations of the clavichord. Nonetheless, at the end in measure 35, we do have a block chord, which if you read from the bass on up is C2 up to C3, and then E4, G4, and C5. And that is clearly a C major chord, and so we finally reach our tonic triad, or uppercase Roman numeral 1. So let's examine, in line with what I was talking about, that this final phrase from really measure 33 to the end is a recapitulation of the opening 4 measures. Recall once again that the opening 4 measures are a 1 chord, a 2-4-2, a 5-6-5, that is G7 over B, and finally C. Isn't that the same thing that we have here? Remembering, again, I know that it's a lot of speaking, but remember that in measure 33, that F major chord over tonic pedal is behaving like a secondary tonic. Here's the 2-4-2 over tonic pedal, or really just 2-4-2 in third inversion, and then continuing with the tonic pedal in measure 34, our G7 over B over tonic pedal. This progression, 2-4-2, 2, I'm going to box it out, 5-6-5, and then to 1, and if we count the, going back to the beginning of the system, the 4 over tonic pedal, this progression here, chord 1 to chord 2 to 5 to 1, when I said chord 1, I just meant the first chord, not literally the tonic chord. This progression is a variation of the opening 4 measures, which brings us full circle in this piece to the conclusion. It's really quite remarkable. But what's still remarkable, even more on top of this, is that we still don't have a proper, perfect, authentic cadence. And that's one of the things that Bach really delays until the fugue in this prelude and fugue set. If you jump ahead, we're not going to do this together now, but if you jump ahead to the fugue and look at the cadence there, it is a PAC, a perfect authentic cadence, which you remember has to meet 2 conditions. You have to have the 5 and the 1 chord both in root position, check, and you have to have, once you get to the tonic chord at the end, you need the tonic tone, the first scale degree, to be in the highest sounding voice as well as in the bass, which it's going to be in the bass because the chords have to be in root position. So the question becomes, do we have a PAC here? And the answer is no, because look at the second to last chord, the penultimate chord in measure 34, leading to the 1 chord in measure 35, is not a 5-7. It's a 5-7 in first inversion. So 5-6-5 to 1, regardless of the tonic pedal, does not qualify this as a PAC. It certainly is an authentic cadence, but exactly like the cadence that we had early on in measures 3 to 4, where you heard this, G7 over B, and then C. That is, if you remember, an inverted, imperfect, authentic cadence. So, there's a lot going on here. Let's label this. So let's take a look at this page where you have a reduction, and let's just put all the information we discussed onto this reduction. It'll be a little bit easier to see. So the first chord that you see starting in measure 32 is a C dominant 7th, which remember is acting as a secondary dominant, right? It's not in the primary key, therefore it's secondary. And this is a 5-7 of what the chord that it's temporarily tonicizing, which is the F major chord that follows. So here it is, F major, as you recall, over C. And remember that I'm choosing strategically, analytically, to call this a 4 over tonic pedal, okay? The reason that I have half notes here indicated is just because here the harmonic movement accelerates, and the next chord in this measure becomes a D minor 7 over C, which I'm now calling a 2-4-2. So I'm not including the overtonic pedal label here because this is just like the second chord in the entirety of the piece in measure 2, right? So this is just a reminder to me that, wow, it's the same chord as we had in measure 2, therefore serving a kind of recapitulatory purpose here at the end. The next chord is our G7 over B over C, which is a 5-6-5 over tonic pedal. The next half note that you see is just a respelling of the same chord. And the reason I did this is so that you can see how the voice leading moves down to the final chord. And the final chord, of course, is simply just 1 and C major. So look at that voice leading. Look at the first G7 over B. you'll notice that the F, the seventh of the chord, is all the way at the top on the fifth line of the treble staff, which is F5. And in the process of this gradual arpeggiation, right, that's an F that I'm pausing on, you see an octave displacement down to this F, and then that F in turn, like every chordal seventh, resolves down a step to the third scale degree. All right, so that is our, there's not a suspension here, but that's kind of, scale degree 4 resolving down to scale degree 3, which is what happens when you have the seventh of a dominant seventh chord resolving to the third of the tonic triad, which of course is scale degree 3. So that's just voice leading to help understand how we got from F5 down to F4 and then resolving down to E4. Okay, and then the upper voices, you can see that the B, which is B4 on the third line, it, as expected, as a leading tone, as scale degree 7, tends to resolve up to the tonic. It doesn't have to, especially when it's inside the texture in the inner voices, but it does here, and that is strengthened by the D5 above it that also resolves down to that C5 on the third space. All right, so in essence, we have a very kind of sophisticated but clear voice leading plan so that all of the notes resolve, let's just use the word organically, right? It doesn't bother our ear as we hear this. Here again is the real texture of the music. This is the last two measures. So everything sounds coherent and driven toward that cadence. It's a very clear progression. So now that we have all of this information in front of us, right, let's kind of reflect on what Bach ends up doing in these final two systems. So let's go back. So I want to show this in terms of the score. So let's take a look starting from this page. So this screen, you'll forgive some of my notes along the way, but starting from measure 20, if you recall at the very beginning of this video, I was trying to remember which measure begins properly phrase number 4. So there it is, measure 20. Bach does some very interesting things. Measure 20, I'll just recap, it's sort of outside the purview of this particular video, but just so you know, we are looking at a C7 chord, right? This is a C dominant 7th chord. Hopefully you recognize this as the chord that begins the final phrase, right? So it's the chord that begins phrase number 4. It's also the chord that begins phrase number 5. How about that? Some parallelism, right? That's actually kind of striking. So this is a C7 chord, which you know is a secondary dominant. So we're just going to jump in and label this a 5/7 of 4, okay? Continue on to the next measure, and here we have what looks like an F major chord, but there is an additional note there that I just circled. So if you do the analysis, we have F up to F, and then A, C, and E, and that is just a beautiful sound. It's one of my favorite chords, the F major 7 chord. Right, there's something so modern about this. Not that a major 7th chord is actually modern. It's been around for centuries. Obviously, this piece is from, at least 1722, if not composed somewhat earlier. But the point is, just the sound of that major 7th chord has such modern associations with contemporary popular styles. So there is something very, I hesitate to use this word, but almost timeless in this music. So start with measure 20. We've got our C7 chord. The top note E is a common tone to the next chord, the F major 7. Okay, so let's put a label to that. So measure 21 is an F major 7 chord. So that is, in terms of the key of C, that's 4, 7, as you can see right there. And then there are these two difficult chords that a lot of people get confused with. So let's just get that out of the way so that there's no confusion. Okay, the next measure has the following notes: F sharp up to C, A, C, and E flat. This should be pretty familiar to you if you watched the previous video about phrase number 4, because all this is, well, here, let's jump ahead. All this is look on this page at measure 28, right? That's the second measure of system number 2. Same notes, F sharp, A, C, and E flat, certainly arranged differently, and in this case over a dominant pedal. But if you go back to what we just saw, that's the same chord. This is an F sharp, fully diminished 7th chord in root position. Just like in the later example in measure 28, here, this is a secondary leading tone chord, or a leading tone 7th chord. So this is a 7, fully diminished 7 of, well, remember the root of the chord, F sharp, is serving as a leading tone to the note, to the pitch, a semitone above the chordal root. So F sharp, up a semitone is G. And G is the dominant in the key of C, so this is a 7/7 of 5. Okay? Now, before you worry about, well, where's the resolution to this secondary leading tone chord? Where's the dominant? Well, we know where it is, because if you just have patience for one more measure, so skip ahead to measure 24, there it is. There is that 5 chord, and you know that from this point forward, from measure 24 all the way until measure 32 or through measure 31, we have a dominant prolongation. So that is, if I'm not mistaken, 8 individual measures of dominant prolongation. So you don't have to worry about going back here to measure 22 with that F sharp fully diminished 7th chord. You don't have to worry, where is the resolution? Bach gives it to you in spades. The real question is, what is the chord that follows in measure 23 before that enormous dominant prolongation? So let's take a look at that. So in measure 23, that's the last measure of this page, we have the following notes. A flat in the bass, up to F, B, C, and D. Sounds like this. Well, one of these notes doesn't belong, right? There's a chordal tone here, or rather a non-chord tone, an NCT, that doesn't belong. And I'm going to put you out of your misery here as you try to figure it out. The passing tone, C, right there, that's a passing tone, is the note that does not belong to this harmony, because if you remove the C, look at what you have. A flat, F, B, D. You rearrange those notes, and that is simply a B fully diminished 7th chord over A flat. Okay? Now, that is pretty easy to analyze in the context of C, because B, after all, is the root, is scale degree 7. So this is a 7 fully diminished 7th chord over its 7th, right? B, D, F, A flat. So this is a third inversion, 7, 4, 2, in our primary key, right? In the key of C. Before you start wondering, well, but wait a second, C major, or C Ionian, right? It doesn't have any sharps or flats. So where does this A flat come from? Remember that this is an example of modal mixture. We are borrowing from the parallel C minor scale, which has 3 flats, B flat, E flat, and point being A flat, and we're borrowing that to insert the A flat into an otherwise half diminished 7th chord. So B, D, F, A, that is the diatonic 7/7 chord that occurs in the C major scale. If we borrow A flat from the parallel minor, then we've got that B fully diminished 7th chord, and that's where the A flat comes from as a harmonic explanation. But melodically, voice leading, look at what's happening here. Go back to measure 22. You can see that F sharp is in the bass, followed by A flat in the bass of measure 23. That's such an interesting sound, because while in a well-tempered system that sounds just like a major second, it's not. This is absolutely not a step, because F to A, no matter what accidentals you have, is a third. It's a skip. So what kind of third is F sharp? Up to A flat? Well, definitely dissonant, right? This is a diminished third. So this interval of a diminished third, as the semantics of tonal music dictate, requires resolution. Well, resolution to what? This is a kind of chromatic double neighbor around the dominant tone that follows, and not only follows, but is reiterated 16 times, twice per measure, over eight measures in the following phrase. So this diminished third has so much potential energy because of that dissonance that is finally realized with that G that follows. And again, we can skip ahead, look at all those Gs starting in measure 24, 25, and so on, right? It just keeps going and going and going. So this diminished third is very, very important. And as far as the explanation for the progression, well, it's actually not so crazy. The root of measure 22 is F sharp. The root of measure 23 is B. F sharp down to B is a circle of fifths progression. And if you think about it, this entire piece is governed by a circle of fifths, well, not A, but circle of fifths progressions. Think about, as I was talking about earlier, right? Think about the opening four measures. C, then D minor 7 over C, G7 over B, and C. Now, don't worry about what's in the bass. Worry about the root progression. So starting in measure 2, the root is D. Measure 3, the root is G. And in measure 4, the root is C. Those are all fifths or fourths. It doesn't matter, fifth down, fourth up. They're all inversions, so it doesn't matter. But if you want to hear it as just a sort of cascade of descending fifths, it's D, down to G, down to C. So this is another motivic intervallic progression that Bach utilizes all throughout the piece. That is the circle of fifths progression. So measure 22 to measure 23 with this F sharp fully diminished seventh, and then B fully diminished seventh over A flat. I'm going to leave out the passing tone C. This is completely in line with Bach's language as far as harmonic progression is concerned in the music. Again, reiterating the bass progression, F sharp up to A flat, that diminished third, it settles by the F sharp resolving up to G, the A flat resolving down to G. These two, again, what are called chromatic neighbors around G, and then the G sitting as a prolonged tone for 8 measures before we finally resolve into the concluding 4 measures, which are recapitulatory when viewed against the opening 4 measures. So, wow, that's a lot of stuff. Why don't we listen to the whole thing starting from measure 20. So here's what the music sounds like. Again, we start with that C7 chord. F major 7. F sharp full diminished 7. Circle of fifths progression down to the B fully diminished seventh over A flat with the passing tone C. Okay, now fast forward to the next series. Now our dominant prolongation. It's such a dynamic piece of music. It's really extraordinary, I think. And I've been teaching this piece for so many years, and I've been playing it for so many years, and it retains a freshness every single time I play it. Now, of course, you as a listener, you may disagree with some of my interpretive decisions. You may say that maybe I'm playing it in a sort of exaggerated way to maybe highlight some of these analytical decisions that I've been describing. But even so, that's kind of the beauty of this kind of process, is we as musicians slash analysts, as thinkers about music, as performers, we have the right to do so, and we also have the right to change our minds. And remember, however I analyze this music, the pitches themselves don't change. So this is going to be a Bach prelude, as long as I play the notes at the right time in the right place. It's going to be a Bach prelude no matter what I say about it. But the analysis helps us understand perhaps a little bit of what Bach might have been thinking as he composed the music. Now, of course, that's ultimately impossible to know, right? Bach died a long time ago in 1750. It's difficult to peek inside the mind of a musical thinker, or someone who had such remarkable musical architecture as Bach certainly had. Not just as evidenced by this one example, but by an oeuvre of over 1,000 well-known and established pieces by this point that have become available through musicology and discovery. What I'm trying to say is that when we analyze like this, we end up peeking inside the musical thinking of a composer. And so for me, this kind of theory and the analysis that serves that theory, what it does, it reveals something about the creative world of the creator of this music, of the composer of this music. So whether I'm correct in this or no, because ultimately it's speculative what I'm saying, there is an attempt to reverse engineer the compositional process. And that, for me, is the purpose of music theory. That is what music theory serves. So when we go through these phrases, as we've done, and we talk about all sorts of vocabulary and nomenclature and labeling systems and observations, it's not just for the sake of theory. It's not theory with as a means to its own end. It's analysis in the service of theory as a means to an end based on understanding possibly how a composer might have been thinking. And that, to me, is worthwhile. That's the same way I think that we analyze literature or film, is we try to get inside the head of the creator or creators of the art form. So that, for me, is the purpose of this kind of analysis. So as I scan forward here, you can see that what we end up happening is a full-scale piece that not only has a number of these circle of fifths progressions, but one that completely avoids an actual full-on resolution through the PAC at the end, or the lack of PAC at the end. In fact, this cadence here, just to look at it, because it's so much easier from this perspective, is an inverted, imperfect, authentic cadence. Right? Remember, inverted because one of the chords is in inversion, the 5-6-5, and anything that's automatically not a perfect authentic cadence is imperfect. That stands to reason, right? So what a piece of music. I will put up more videos with the other phrases, but that's what I wanted to share with you today. So that is the Bach Prelude, measures 20 through 35, the last two phrases of the music.